advocacy experts in the House. My name is Kim Anderson. I'm the director of the Center for Advocacy here at the NEA, and I just want to welcome you all and thank you very much for coming. We are engaged, obviously, in an incredibly important fight, and that's why we're all joined together. And a couple of the experts that we're fortunate enough to have here with us to guide us through this conversation is Joel Packer, to my left, who is the Executive Director of the Committee on Education Funding and has been a legend, right? Still is a legend in this town, in his own mind, for 30-plus years now, and there isn't anybody who understands discretionary spending better than Joel. And obviously to my right, Bob Greenstein, who Joel will introduce from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. We all know that we have both a fight on the discretionary side and the revenue side. And for those of you who want to talk about revenue and whose organizations feel comfortable weighing in on revenue, we also have Sean Crowley here from Americans for Tax Reform. So he has some information for you if you want, and if you have any questions about that as well. So without further ado, I will turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Joel Packer, and thanks again.
Well, thanks, Kim, and I really want to thank NEA for hosting this event. As you see, we have quite a large turnout, an incredible turnout, and there aren't a lot of groups in our sphere that have capacity to hold this large a meeting. So it was either this or the Verizon Center, so this worked out a lot better. I also just mentioned that Kim and I used to have offices right next to each other. We were both lobbyists for NEA, and NEA is very blessed to have Kim as their leader of their Center on Advocacy, because she's really one of the most effective and respected advocates that I've worked with in my career, so it's great to be working with her and her team again. Thank you. A couple of just housekeeping things. We're recording this whole session, so when you ask questions, try to be appropriate. And if you want to use the wireless network, the username is guestNEA and the password is diamond. So hopefully that'll work. So anyhow, as Kim said, I'm Joel Packer. I work for the Rabin Group and serve as the Executive Director of the Committee for Education Funding. I just want to briefly explain why we're all here. Earlier this year, CEF, the Committee for Education Funding, along with the Coalition for Health Funding, and over here is Emily Halubowicz, the Executive Director of the Coalition for Health Funding. So CEF, Coalition for Health Funding, and the Campaign to Invest in America's Workforce, our three coalitions joined together to organize a sign-on letter to the Appropriations Committee. The letter was focused on the labor HHS education bill, urged the committee to invest in those programs, not cut them, protect them from sequestration, et cetera. And we ended up having over 900 organizations sign the letter, which I personally thought was pretty astounding. And then as it became apparent that we were going to have a big fight on our hands over sequestration and other possible cuts to non-defense discretionary, or NDD, spending, our three coalitions decided we needed to sort of broaden the array of groups that work together and to expand it beyond education, health, and workforce training. So we reached out to other coalitions in a whole range of areas, which is, again, why you're all here. So we reached out to folks in environment, social services, interior, law enforcement, transportation, science, research, housing, international affairs, to see if everyone was willing to work together to protect non-defense discretionary programs from the sequester. Everyone agreed to work together, which is today's meeting as a result of those efforts. So what we're going to do today is we're going to hear from Bob Greenstein, who's the founder and president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. We'll then take a few questions on his presentation. And then next, Emily, as I said, the Executive Director of the Coalition for Health Funding and our overall ringleader for this effort, will provide more details on the NDD Summit, as we've called this group, talk more about what we're doing, what our plans are for future actions, and some joint activities. And then we'll take a few questions on those plans. So while Emily's going to explain in more detail the summit, I do want to acknowledge the members of the steering committee who helped put today's event together and organized where we are up till now. So in addition to Emily and myself, the other people on the steering committee, so I'll just read their names and just ask them to stand up to be acknowledged. So Mary Jo Hoeksema from the Census Project and the Ad Hoc Group for Medical Research. I don't know if she's here. Alan Rossum from the Wilderness Society. Alan? Maybe our steering committee's out having a party someplace. Linda Couch from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Yay, Linda. Christine Leonard from the Vera Institute of Justice. There she is, way in the back. Samuel Rankin from the American Mathematical Society and the Coalition for National Science Funding. He's back there, too. Rachel Gregg from the Campaign to Invest in America's Workforce. Ellen Nissenbaum from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who keeps all of our numbers straight. Scott Schlesinger from the National Resources Defense Council, back over there. Liz Marcy from Bread for the World, over there. Jared Solomon from First Focus Campaign for Children, Jared, and Nancy Zirkin from the Leadership Conference on Human and Civil Rights. So that's been the group that's sort of been meeting and putting all these plans together, and again, Emily will talk more about that. So now I'm going to introduce Bob. For those who don't know Bob is one of the acknowledged experts on the federal budget and a range of domestic policy areas, from anti-poverty programs to tax policy, to health reform and Social Security. He's written endless reports, analyses, books, blog posts, etc. Some of them are on your chair. In 1996, he was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship for making the center a model for nonpartisan research and policy. 2008, he received the Heinz Award for Public Policy for his work to improve the economic outlook of many of America's poorer citizens. And he also received the John Gardner Leadership Award, given annually by Independent Sector. He, in 2010, received the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Prize from the American Academy of Political and Social Science, which cited him as a champion of evidence-based policy whose work at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities is respected on both sides of the aisle. Prior to founding the Center, Bob was the administrator of the Food and Nutrition Service at the Agriculture Department under President Carter. He helped design the landmark Food Stamp Act of 1977. He was also appointed by President Clinton in 1994 to serve on the Bipartisan Commission on Entitlement and Tax Reform. He's a graduate of Harvard and has received honorary degrees from Tufts and Occidental. And just one quick story before I turn it over to Bob to demonstrate how respected the Center is as an expert on the budget. A couple of months ago, I emailed some senior officials at OMB with some technical questions about how the sequester would impact education. And the OMB folks responded to me by saying, we're not responding to those questions at this point in time, but we suggest you talk to some outside budget experts like the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. So I've suggested that they might want to send OMB a bill for consulting services. But with that, I'll turn it over to Bob, who's going to walk us through kind of what we're all facing.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, I think OMB was specifically referring people to Richard Kogan, who's sitting on the front row here, who was with the Center for a number of years and then really was senior advisor to the first two directors of OMB during the current administration behind all the numbers. And we're going to get into in just a couple of minutes some numbers, some of which may surprise you and alarm you about non-defense discretionary spending, and Richard has produced all of these numbers and is really, as your story indicates, really the top expert on this probably in the city. So you all know that there are big issues coming in the lame duck. I actually think they may not be fully resolved in the lame duck. They may well go into 2013. A number of you, I know, are focused appropriately on the threat from sequestration. But if there's any basic message in what I'm about to go through, it is that the threats to non-defense discretionary programs from sequestration are modest compared to the even larger, much bigger threats to non-defense discretionary programs from the larger budget debates of which the sequestration issue is just one part. I'm going to start with, this is a story you all know. It just goes through all the things that are coming up at the end of the year, the tax cuts expiring, the third bullet, automatic across-the-board cuts, that's sequestration, hitting the debt limit, Medicare payments. Now, what I think isn't recognized as widely, but is really important to get your mind around, is that amidst all of the partisan division, there actually is bipartisan concurrence at the leadership level, at least, on three key fiscal policy issues. And these three issues set the framework that the rest of the debate occurs in. Number one, there's a broad agreement. President shares it. Democratic leaders on the Hill do. Republican leaders want to go even farther than this. There's an agreement that we need at least enough deficit reduction over the coming decade to stabilize the debt. That is, to keep the debt, after the economy's recovered, to keep the debt from rising faster than the economy is growing. And getting there from here requires somewhat more than $3 trillion of additional deficit reduction over the next 10 years, on top of the trillion or so already done in the Budget Control Act from the caps it placed on discretionary spending. You add the two together, and you get the $4 trillion deficit reduction number you often hear in the press. The second area of broad bipartisan concurrence is that there are not going to be significant Social Security or Medicare cuts for current retirees or those nearing retirement. All you got to do is look at the Paul Ryan budget to see this. What are the Ryan budget savings in Social Security over the next 10 years? Zero. Medicare, a few $100 billion. That's out of over $5 trillion in cuts that the Ryan budget contains. And the third area of sort of broad bipartisan concurrence, again at the leadership level, is that we shouldn't reduce defense below the levels it's set at under the caps in the Budget Control Act enacted last August, which does have some reductions in defense spending there. There clearly are individual members who would cut defense further, but it's not where the president or most of the Democratic leadership is, and of course the Republican leadership wants to increase defense over the levels in last year's Budget Control Act caps. Now, this provides a key framework because you now ask the question, if Social Security, Medicare, and defense will not constitute much of the more than $3 trillion that's needed, where's the money come from? Well, the answer, the math is pretty clear. If there is no revenue contribution, there are only two large parts of the budget left. There's various pieces of change, but there's two large parts of the budget left, and they are non-defense discretionary, cut it much deeper, and low-income programs, Medicaid, food stamps, supplemental security income, and the like. The bottom line is if you don't have a significant revenue contribution to deficit reduction, then those programs, NDD in particular, will face really massive cuts. Now, illustration, the Ryan budget. By the way, some of you may be puzzled by my saying that the Ryan budget doesn't have that much in Medicare savings in the first 10 years, thinking I thought Ryan has this really controversial Medicare voucher plan. He does. It doesn't take effect until the second decade. It doesn't touch current retirees or people who retire in the next 10 years for obvious political reasons. Okay. So the Ryan budget illustrates this point. It doesn't have any more defense savings. It doesn't touch Social Security. Medicare is modest. It actually adds money back to defense. And it has no revenues. And it murders NDD and low-income programs. So the Ryan budget gets about 62% of its cuts in the first 10 years from low-income programs. But I'm going to focus more on its impact on NDD. So look at this slide. There are a lot of pieces of information to absorb from this slide. Let's start with the blue bar. So what we're doing here is we're taking the year 2021, the last year the caps under the Budget Control Act are in effect, and we're comparing the funding levels to those in effect this year. Now, there already have been cuts this year, right? We're already down for NDD in general. So if you were comparing it to, say, the 2010 level adjusted for inflation, the cuts would be deeper. So under the Budget Control Act caps, you'd have a 6.6% cut overall in NDD in 2021 compared to today's levels adjusted for inflation. That's without sequestration. If sequestration also occurs, then the total cut by 2021 is 11.7%. But under the Ryan budget, it's 27.5%. It's about 2.5 times as deep as if full sequestration takes effect. Here's another way to look at it. The flat bar in the middle, just set at 0, is basically adherence to the Budget Control Act caps. This shows that the Ryan budget increases defense spending over the caps, but cuts non-defense discretionary way below the caps. The cap is the middle bar. The red line is where the Ryan budget puts non-defense discretionary. Or here's the same story in number terms. So this is cuts that the Ryan budget has relative to the caps in the Budget Control Act. Notice that over the coming, I guess it's a 9-year period from 2013 through 2021 under the Ryan budget, you have $1.26 trillion in additional NDD cuts on top of those that are to be made under the caps in the Budget Control Act. And by the way, in some respects, it's a little worse than that. Those of you who work in the higher ed area know there are funding issues relating to Pell Grants. There's a Pell Grant shortfall over the coming 10 years of about $50 billion. Well, under the Ryan budget, even though it has Pell cuts, it increases the shortfall to $161 billion, meaning either you really savage Pell Grants or you cut the rest of NDD even deeper in order to fill the shortfall in the Pell Grant program. So the moral of the story here is sequestration is unacceptable enough, but the NDD cuts that are on the table go way beyond it. And given the bipartisan concurrence on a need for enough deficit reduction to stabilize the debt and not doing big things in the next 10 years on Social Security and Medicare and not going much farther, if at all, in defense beyond the cuts that are in the caps in the Budget Control Act, the conclusion emerges that there must be a balanced approach to deficit reduction, which pretty much everything on the table, very much including revenues, or else sequestration will look like a picnic compared to what does happen to NDD. It's a grim story, but it's very clearly what the math shows. By the way, when the first version of the Ryan budget came out in March 2011, I thought, well, this is really an extreme budget. I mean, this is well outside the bounds of what either party for decades would have talked about. But it's now very much in the mainstream of one of our two great parties. What was striking during the primary period last fall and early this year was that every one of the Republican presidential candidates actually proposed a budget that cut deeper than the Ryan budget does. So I just have one slide on this, but this is the Romney budget. Romney increases defense well above Ryan's levels to 4% of GDP, has big tax cuts, calls for capping total federal spending, including defense, and interest payments at 20% of GDP, and calls for a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. So Richard Kogan modeled what this would mean two ways. If you assume the budget was balanced by, I think it was 2022, and if you didn't assume the budget was balanced. And we also assumed, we put defense at the Romney levels, and Romney has said he would not cut Social Security in the coming decade. And Richard simply calculated, well, what percentage would you have to cut everything else other than Social Security and defense? And by 2022, the answer was 40% if you didn't balance the budget and 59% if you did have to balance the budget. Now, these figures are extraordinary, and I don't actually think if elected Romney would do them. I think he would just go along with the Ryan budget. But I just put this up to illustrate that the Ryan budget is no longer some outlier that cannot be taken seriously. And the conclusion with regard to sequestration that I and my colleagues at the Center on Budget draw from this is that much as we hate sequestration, our sense is that Harry Reid's posture is precisely the right one, that you hold the line on not lifting sequestration until you get revenues on the table. By the way, there's a little background here. In the negotiations that led up to the Budget Control Act, the Obama administration said if the supercommittee fails and we want $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction, we want to design a trigger that's half spending and half revenues. The Republicans refused. And during the course of the negotiations, the administration finally said, well, if you won't agree to any revenues at all, if it isn't half spending and half revenues, we want half domestic and half defense spending. And the Republicans found that far more acceptable than half revenues and half spending. And that's why the sequestration ended up getting designed the way it did. The idea was that revenues would have been better, but that revenues or the big defense hits are entirely designed from the administration's standpoint, and frankly, from my standpoint, as the gun to the head to try to get Republican members to move on revenue so we can have a balanced package that equitably shares the pain and we don't murder NDD and low-income programs. And that is one of the only weapons that can do that. So ironically, if one prematurely relents on sequestration and gets no revenues in return, my conclusion is over time it hurts NDD more, because we're then on a path to getting $3 trillion plus in deficit reduction with no revenue contribution, which means that the total size of the cuts in NDD are likely to be much bigger than where you end up under sequestration. Now, you may say there must be some other options. In theory, one option is to just keep kicking the can down the road, but that's becoming increasingly hard to do after the economy recovers. The long-term trajectory is not very sustainable. This is one on where the debt goes, and beyond that, there are growing threats from the rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch, that if we go through 2013 without bigger deficit reduction action, that they'll downgrade or further downgrade U.S. securities. Some people say, oh, well, healthcare costs are a big contributor, just hit healthcare costs. Well, what healthcare programs would we hit? Our problem is system-wide growth in healthcare costs. Medicaid already serves the poorest people in the country and actually costs less than private insurance did. There can be some savings in Medicare, but we did most of the provider savings we know how to do to help pay for the Affordable Care Act. So they're already in law. We need to discover new ways to slow the rate of growth of healthcare costs, but we don't have them yet. And it's not as though Medicare and Medicaid are rising faster than private insurance. I probably have disagreement with some in the room on this. I am in favor of asking affluent beneficiaries to pay somewhat higher premiums in Medicare, but there are fewer of them than one might think. Half of all Medicare beneficiaries are below about $23,000, $24,000 a year. So there isn't huge money there. By the way, there's another graph we've done that gets shown a lot on cable TV that seeks to answer the question, how could it be that in 2001 surpluses were projected as far as the eye could see? Alan Greenspan testified he was worried the budget surpluses were going to be too big. How do we get from huge surpluses to huge deficits? And this tells you the story in a graph. There really were 5 big factors. Well, we're winding down the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we can't retroactively erase them. The recovery measures, most of us probably think we didn't do enough, but we're not doing any more. Those are baked into the cake, as are TARP and Fannie and Freddie, and obviously the economic downturn. The only one of these 5 things that is not baked into the cake yet are the Bush-era tax cuts going forward, on which we have a big decision coming at the end of the year. The following is completely politically impossible. unfortunately, in my view. I would, if I had my druthers, I wouldn't allow the Bush tax cuts above $250,000 a year. I would, once the economy was strong enough to absorb it, let all of them expire and go back to the Clinton-era tax rates. But the moral of this graph is simply to show that to stabilize the debt, the thing that you need $3 trillion in deficit reduction for, that means not balancing the budget, but getting deficits to about 3% of GDP. Well, for the coming decade, one could get most of the way there simply by allowing all of the Bush tax cuts to expire. But lately, we're kind of going in the wrong direction. This is a graph we did last week showing how much of the upper income tax cut savings we lose just by going from $250,000 to $1 million. There also is growing discussion of what are called tax expenditures, credits, deductions, and things of the sort. Interesting quote from Martin Feldstein, conservative Harvard economist. He was chairman of the Council of Economics Advisors for a while for President Reagan, that these are really the most wasteful form of government spending. I put it up because I wanted to get to the next graph, in which you see that the total amount we spend in tax expenditures at over $1 trillion is nearly double total non-defense discretionary spending. Again, you look at this graph and you realize there's a relationship here. If we can get savings from tax expenditures and use it for deficit reduction rather than cutting rates even below the Bush levels, then we're not going to have to cut non-defense discretionary programs anywhere near as heavily. I should say I know that for a number of people in the room, your organization doesn't work, and probably in some cases, given your charter or mission or board, probably can't work on revenues. But for others of you, even if you haven't worked on them in the past, if you're able to, I would urge you to consider becoming part of a larger coalition that works on revenues, because without them we really can't defend NDD. This is kind of the mission of this new campaign, Americans for Tax Fairness, that a number of us have joined, and that I think Joel mentioned there might be some literature given out on later. One last thing on tax expenditures. This is from the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. It just shows you that 66% of all tax expenditures, the cost of all tax expenditures, are benefits to the top fifth of the population and about a quarter to the top 1%. So in a nutshell, that's the grim story. I've been working on not all of these issues, but at least some subset of these issues, since coming to Washington longer ago than I care to remember in July 1972. I have never been so concerned or alarmed. I sort of think of, we're all in these, it's all our jobs. You're in these policy battles every year. Not every year is equal, but some periods are huge. You think of the 1930s, you think of the 1960s. There were massive changes made in policy that became part of the framework for government, for society. We all still live in today. We're in, it's very much it wasn't like just a one-year appropriation. It was a fundamental change. I think the chances are pretty high that whether it's 2012, 2013, or whether it takes 2, 3, 4, 5 years, I don't think it's clear. We might not do this all in one step. But I think we're entering one of these pivotal periods. There are going to be wrenching changes made. And given that the population will continue to age and healthcare costs will continue to rise, it's not like there will then be an election 5 years down the road and we'll undo all the decisions. Kind of like with the 30s and the 60s, I think there's a very high chance there'll be wrenching decisions made, and they may subsequently get changed around the edges, but that, in the big picture, they will endure. So this is absolutely critical. And the risks to non-defense discretionary programs, as well as to low-income entitlement programs, are greater, I think, than at any point I can remember, greater than under the Contract with America or Ronald Reagan's first year, because of these larger fiscal pressures that are the context within which these decisions are being made. Reagan did cuts in 81. A lot of them were subsequently undone. I don't think we can count on that happening here. Even take the fact that, we've had times in the past when we had 5-year discretionary caps. These are 10 years, and they're much more, they're tougher than what was in place before. So the question is, I think, how to organize all of ourselves to be able to have the maximum impact in this absolutely crucial set of battles coming ahead. And I just want to thank and congratulate all the people who are starting to organize this coalition because I think it is very badly needed. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bob. So, because of the time of the day, we thought about calling this Budget Happy Hour, but then we saw Bob's presentation and we decided that wasn't the right name. We have time just for a couple of questions of Bob. So Emily's going to talk more about our next steps, but if people have questions about the numbers or sort of the overall outlook, now is your time. There's a couple of microphones on the floor. Hopefully Bob hasn't totally depressed everybody where you can't even think of a question, but... Is this presentation going to be available, Emily?
Yes.
Yes, we're going to email it to...
We will send a link to the recording and notes and the slides sometime soon.
I should just note, if you get it and you're a little confused, because there's a bunch of slides I didn't use. I often do this. I throw a bunch of slides at the end that I think might be useful depending on the questions I get. So there's a bunch of additional slides at the end that you didn't see.
Okay, well, if there's no question... Oh, there is a question. Just tell us your name and what organization or coalition you're with.
I'm Stephanie Arnold-Pang, and I work with the National Coalition of STD Directors. And since I don't work on tax policy, I was wondering if you could cover just generally what you're talking about when you're talking about tax expenditures on these types of slides.
Oh, okay, that's a very good question. Tax expenditures is a really abstract term. Sometimes people refer to them as tax loopholes, but that's a bit of a misnomer. Some of them are loopholes and some of them aren't things we think about as loopholes. Tax expenditures are really pretty much all deductions, credits, exclusions, and preferential rates. They include things that are terrific policy. They're not all bad loopholes. The Earned Income Tax Credit for low-income working families, extremely important. Lifts millions of the working poor out of poverty. It's a tax expenditure. The preferential rate on capital gains, about my least favorite tax expenditure. Things that are very popular, I would argue, not very well designed, regressive. You could have better effects for less money, but they're really hard to touch. The mortgage interest deduction, tax preferences for retirement savings, the employer health exclusion is a tax expenditure. Charitable contribution deduction is a tax expenditure. So is the deduction for state and local income taxes, as are, various egregious things like all the oil and gas tax breaks. And the difficulty is that the most egregious examples, corporate jets, you can close it and you get about $3 billion, I think, over 10 years. The big money is in the more popular ones, but there really is also a lot of money in the preferential rate on capital gains. So it's that whole array of measures.
Okay. Let's go to this side.
I'm Ben Korb with the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. I guess this is a naive question, but I'm wondering, are we certain that sequestration is even going to happen, or is there still doubt that it may not happen at all?
Oh, I think it's... My personal view, this is not based on, there is no inside knowledge to have, right? There is no deal at this point. Sequestration, people think of 1.2 trillion. It's actually, about 1 trillion and about 200 billion in interest savings, give or take. And the 1 trillion is really 9 increments of about, $109 billion each, Richard? My own belief is that if sequestration occurs in 2013, that'll be the only year it actually occurs in. I just can't see it happening every year for 9 years, particularly given the pressure on the defense side. And I think that there is going to be some larger budget deal, whether it's in lame duck or more likely early 2013. I'm terrified about what that deal might be. And there could be a deal that is worse for NDD than sequestration, as the Ryan budget indicates. You take the NDD caps and you lower the caps to levels below where you'd be under sequestration. That's what the Ryan budget does. Ryan gets rid of sequestration, but he has NDD cuts much deeper than if sequestration remained in effect. So this is why, I don't want to minimize the concerns over sequestration. But at the end of the day, I think the big issue is what's the overall architecture of the emerging budget deals? And in particular, for NDD, do the BCA caps get lowered further? I think it's helpful that the administration, at least where they are as of now in their budget and before any negotiations start, is don't lower the Budget Control Act caps on either defense or non-defense any further. Stick with the caps. That's the optimal outcome, given where we are now in those negotiations for NDD. But I think the bigger issue is going to be where are the caps set on NDD rather than sequestration, which I ultimately think, I think there's a reasonable chance it takes effect in January because there isn't a deal. I think if there is no deal at all on anything, extending the Bush tax cuts, the Medicare physician payment cut, sequestration, if there's no deal by January 1st, then in my view there will be a deal within 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks after that. I think it'll be like the government shutdown of 95. Neither side would move. The government shut down. Gingrich thought he'd win. Clinton thought he'd win. Clinton turned out to be right. But the moral of the story was that within about 2.5 weeks, the pressure was so intense that a deal emerged. And while it may sound more dramatic to talk about the government shutting down, actually the stakes for the economy and otherwise of having all the tax cuts and sequestration take effect, all those things happen at once, are bigger, and I think the pressure would be greater than the pressure that emerged during the government shutdown. I think there would be a deal within several weeks, and most likely sequestration would be undone as part of that deal. But there would be a lot of budget cuts, and it's essential there'll be revenue increases put in as the alternative. And that's the key. I forgot to mention one key point, so if you'll give me a second, I'll mention it now. Integrally connected to this is the fight over the debt limit. Right. One of the most important things that happened last year was when the Budget Control Act was passed and the debt limit was raised in August, that Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, Rob Portman, key leaders, Republican leaders in both the House and the Senate, within 48 hours held press conferences where they said, and they're all saying the same thing here, this is the new template, this is the new standard. Henceforth, every dollar that we raise the debt limit must be accompanied by at least $1 in spending cuts. No revenues, just spending cuts. If that is the standard we adhere to, it's over for NDD. Period. Under the Ryan budget, you still have to raise the debt ceiling $5.2 trillion over the next 10 years. Ryan has $5.3 trillion in budget cuts. If that's the standard, you must do budget cuts as deep as those in the Ryan budget. Period. So this is all part of the same larger. I'm recounting a different way the same theme. If you don't have a balanced package with everything on the table, including revenues, we're screwed. And the debt limit is one of the forces that will be used to try to drive that outcome. And there are two levers on the other side, the side of a balanced approach. And the two levers are the scheduled expiration of the Bush tax cuts at the end of the year and sequestration on defense. Those are the two levers we have if we don't want to do a spending cuts only plan that devastates NDD and other programs. So the goal is to use those two levers to get to a balanced package. And
to have our voices heard, so whenever this negotiation occurs, everyone doesn't say, oh, NDD, no one really cares about that. We're not hearing about that, so let's just cut that further, lower the caps, do something else. So part of the reason for this is to have the combined voice of all of our groups and coalitions say, these are important programs, whatever budget deal there may be, don't cut these programs any further.
And it's very much the case that in the super committee deliberations last fall, there were many plans. I mean, no plan got agreement in the super committee, but there were a lot of plans put on the table. Many plans that were put on the table cut the discretionary caps further, deeper. They varied in how much deeper, but that is definitely part of the budget discussion that will go forward.
Okay, well, I have one last question, then Emily will lead us to what we'll do next.
Bob, my name is Al Guida. I represent a bunch of mental health clients. And Bob, just one last question related to the likely procedural landscape after November 7th. So your beginning slide had a very impressive array of fiscal decisions. It was a single slide that had $3 or $4 trillion worth of budget decisions that had to be made between November 7th and December 31st, if I understand the time frame correctly. So is it reasonable to expect that the likely procedural outcome would be some kind of a budget reconciliation process that would punt those decisions into 2013 using a budget reconciliation-like framework?
Great question. I think that a part of that depends on the outcome of the election. I think that if, particularly, say, if the Republicans hold the House, take the Senate, and Governor Romney wins, that they will seek to extend everything for maybe 6 months and then seek to use the budget resolution in early 2013 to set up a reconciliation bill that has big changes in taxes, entitlements. Richard, can you lower discretionary caps in a reconciliation bill?
Bird rule violation.
Bird rule. So they need a separate.
But through a budget resolution, you can lower the allocation.
Through a budget resolution, you can lower if we have 2 allocations.
Yes.
For the coming year.
Yeah, for that. Yeah. And just keep lowering it the base.
Now, there's a second scenario in which there's actually a deal in the lame duck, and it's a so-called framework bill. I think this might be what you're referring to. It's a so-called framework bill. It might or might not lower the BCA cap, the Budget Control Act discretionary caps. It might have a few revenue changes, maybe some entitlement changes, and it might set up a process, particularly in the entitlement and tax reform areas, with targets you were supposed to hit 6 months down the road or whatever. There's a third outcome, and I think the third outcome deserves considerable attention. We think that it is both economically incorrect and strategically unwise to fall into the trap of thinking that if all of this doesn't get done by December 31st, the economy falls into recession. What the Congressional Budget Office has said is that if all the tax cuts expire and stay expired, and sequestration goes into effect and stays in effect, and the Medicare payments to doctors are cut and the cuts stay in effect, that then over the course of the first 6 months of 2013, the economy slips back into recession. But it's actually not a cliff that you go over the cliff and you're dead. I'll show my age here. For my analogy is what it's not. It's not like the car scene in James Dean movie Rebel Without a Cause, where the car. People have told me, Bob, there are much more recent movies you could use.
Thelma and Louise,
where the car goes over the cliff and the guy's dead. Here, if there's no deal by December 31st, the negotiations are going to continue on January 1st and January 2nd. There'll be intense pressure. I think you'd get a deal within several weeks. The reason I bring that up is I do believe, given last year's precedent, that Republican leaders, let's say that President Obama is reelected, I think Republican leaders will refuse throughout the month of December to agree to extend the middle-income tax cuts without the upper-income tax cuts. And so the question is, if he's reelected, should President Obama do? My advice would be hold firm, don't cave. We cannot afford to keep all of these tax cuts. That'll put us into January. That's not the end of the world. I think we'll have a deal. The pressure will be so intense. We'll have a deal at some point in January, and maybe, just maybe, showing that there's equal toughness on the side that favors a balanced approach could lead to a breakthrough. Besides, once you get to January 1st or January 2nd, you can say current policy isn't the top rate of 35% anymore. 39.6% has gone back into effect, and we're willing to work with you to lower that rate on a permanent basis in return for substantial tax expenditure closures, the bulk of the savings of which go to deficit reduction as part of a balanced package. So it's not as though the world ends if you don't have a deal by December 31st, and my fear is that if people do think the world ends if there isn't a deal by December 31st, that those who favor a balanced package will blink first and cave again. And what is absolutely essential, the whole theme of everything I'm saying, there has to be a balanced package. Everything has to contribute, particularly revenues, which are a big cause of the mess we're in at the present time. And so there has to be a strategy to bring that about. And I think things like the emerging NDD coalition are part of what hopefully helps one get to that outcome.
Okay, so Emily is now going to explain the emerging NDD coalition.
And we have technical difficulties again, so bear with me here while I plug in. Pull that up first. This keeps coming unplugged here.
I'm living up to my Luddite reputation.
Does it work? There we go. All right. Get rid of this.
Just click on the
There we go. Well, thank you, Joel. Thank you, everyone, for being here. This is really kind of an unprecedented event, I think, to see all the different NDD constituencies come together. And it's really exciting for me. My name is Emily Halubowicz. I'm the executive director of the Coalition for Health Funding. I see many of my members here, so thank you for being here. Quickly, thanks again to Kim and to Mark Egan for their help in arranging this meeting today. Really appreciate it. Thank you, of course, to Bob and Ellen Nissenbaum from the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities and the entire team there who keep us honest in our accounting and our storytelling. And thanks to Joel and the other members of the steering committee for all of the support that they've been providing going forward. So I'll just give you a little bit of an overview, a little more detail about how we got here and why we're here, and to tell you a little bit more about what we've been doing to date. So if you have been paying attention, you hear them talking about defense a lot and how the sequester will be horrible, will be less safe, we're going to be under attack. So I have this slide, WWDD, what would defense do? As I think about how we advocate for NDD, I think about what they do. And so you see, there are just a couple of websites here. If you haven't seen them yet, I urge you to check them out. Second to None is a really fantastic website. It's secondtonone.org by the aerospace industry, which has the economic impact by state of defense sequester cuts. They estimate there will be 1 million jobs lost. They also have a really handy countdown to sequester clock, so you can check that out. A new initiative just out in the last couple of weeks is defendingdefense.org. This is from the Heritage Foundation, AEI, and the Foreign Policy Initiative. Another great site, they have compendium of clips of military leaders talking about the devastation our country will face under sequester of defense, many video clips and fact sheets as well. Interestingly, I'll thank Ben Bowden, one of our summit members on Friday, alerted me to this. If you go to the House Armed Service Committee website, the pop-up there is how defense sequester is horrible. And you can click on it and see lots of different impact analyses and news articles and, again, video clips. Very interesting. Finally, most recently, there was a letter from 31 of the military associations representing 5 million Americans about the defense sequester and how it's bad. And I thought back to the letter that just Joel, Rachel, and I did with our 302B clique, the Labor HHS Education clique, where we got 900 organizations representing hundreds of millions of Americans. And I thought, wow, we could really do something with this here.
But they have better weapons than we do.
They do have better weapons. But what's interesting, if you read through all these materials, never, ever, anywhere do you say anyone say exempt defense. It is only about how the defense sequester would be bad. The exempt defense movement is really the interpretation of why the impact is bad and saying, well, we'll just exempt defense and we'll fix it. But that's not something they've actually been advocating for. So I think that's interesting to point out. But I think what's clear in this environment is that business as usual, it just isn't working anymore. There's a reason everyone always comes to NDD. We're sort of the whipping post when it comes to these discussions. I believe in part it's because, non-defense discretionary, what does that mean? I think messaging is a part of it. But it's really because we're all fragmented. We don't actually act like a community and a unit. And that's something I think that we're trying to do here through this effort is to really build a brand identity for NDD, to come together as a group and make sure that we're saying the same thing to the same people at the same time. And there can be variations on the theme, and we'll talk about that. But for the most part, that's the only way we're going to really raise the visibility and raise the noise in this community, and we have to stay together. So as we've conceptualized this is I'm unfortunately a graphical learner, but I am graphically challenged. But this is the best thing I could find that was automatic in PowerPoint, where you can see how we kind of relate. We play with pyramids, but that's hierarchical. We didn't like that. So really, so if you can think about this as not really a coalition, but a network of networks, that this is a forum for us to engage the leaders of the various government function coalitions, and there are a lot of them. I've learned we now have about 60 leaders of these groups participating. You have to have some kind of, we're learning, staff. So really the steering committee is more like the staff of this group. These are the worker bees that are producing materials that are then being vetted throughout the summit and then disseminated out throughout the entire community. So if you're wondering, how do I participate? If you're here, you're connected to us. And I think that's sort of how we're operating as you go, as we're learning. I'll talk more about the sign-on letter that's coming. But when you go to vet a sign-on letter, it's hard enough to do it with 60 individuals, let alone 400. So this is a way that we're trying to be inclusive, but also be functional and practical going forward. So again, our organizing framework is, again, not a coalition per se at this stage. We don't plan to have a website. We would love to. I'll note that this is a voluntary coalition. We do not have a budget. There are no dues. And so we're kind of doing what we can with what we have, which isn't much, other than some really passionate and dedicated people. But really, our goal is twofold: to educate policymakers and the public about what NDD is, and by what it is, also how small a part of the budget and shrinking part of the budget it really is. The impact of cuts that we've already sustained since fiscal year 2010, which I think is the baseline for many of us as we started seeing deep cuts, and also to talk about the impact of a sequester on NDD writ large and also our individual communities. We are also advocating a balanced approach to deficit reduction that does not include further cuts to NDD programs. That's the important caveat. We feel, and our rationale for this, as you'll soon see in the letter we're putting forward, is that we are not the drivers of the debt, if you look at all the analyses. And we've already paid our fair share, not to play on the revenue argument, but NDD has done its part already, both through the cuts since fiscal year 2010 and what we'll be seeing through the Budget Control Act cap. So yes, everything should be on the table. We've already been on the table for a long time, sort of hands-off NDD going forward. And so why a balanced approach? I anticipated this question. I think it's clear from our conversations, at least on the Hill, with the administration, as Bob noted, an exempt me strategy will fail. The White House has said he will veto anything that exempts anything that comes out of Congress that is anything but a balanced approach. I think they're serious on this. Bob kind of reinforced that. I think also the fear with an exempt me strategy, if you start saying exempt X, exempt Y, exempt Z, exempt A, we are now the crabs in a barrel, kind of as we always have been, climbing over each other, cannibalizing each other, and we drown each other out. And when you have hundreds of groups coming to you saying, exempt me, exempt me, exempt me, members of Congress don't listen because they don't know what to do with that. And so that's why we're focused on the balanced approach. Important to note, the balanced approach to deficit reduction with no further cuts to NDD, that's really the baseline. That is not to say you can't say more. Many groups in this room can be more visible on revenue. There are coalitions that are forming around revenue. You can say a balanced approach to deficit reduction, that includes tax increases. That's great. If you're able to say that, you should. You can certainly go farther, but we will hope at a minimum you will use the balanced approach as your baseline. What do we mean by balanced approach exactly? That's sort of the question that comes up. Balance is sort of in the eye of the beholder, and if you polled any of us in this room, we probably have different ideas about what a balanced approach is and what it should be. I think what's important here, and this has been our experience, at least at the Coalition for Health Funding on the Hill, they throw that question at you. I think it's to distract from the argument. They know what to do. There are no shortage of bipartisan deficit reduction groups with people who are much more sophisticated probably than any of the lobbyists here in this room who've told them what they need to do. They know what to do. They just don't quite yet have the will to do it. And I think that, at least from our conversations, what they're saying is we need to hear from the NDD community. We're not hearing anything about why NDD is important. We're hearing cut from our constituents back home, and we're hearing from the defense industry here in Washington. That's it. The rest of you have been sort of silent. So I think that if you get that question and you're asked, you can certainly point them to any number of the deficit reduction proposals that have come out in the 2 years that are bipartisan. If you have a position and your organization has an idea about how to do this, you should certainly communicate that wearing the hat of your organization. But I think we don't be too concerned about what a balanced approach means, because honestly, I don't think we're expected to have the answers. And I think they know what to do. So as we're thinking about, so how do we do this? How do we mobilize the community? The NDD Summit has sort of come up with a two-pronged strategy, our inside Washington and our outside Washington strategy. And really, I think as you're thinking through this, all of our advocates have fatigue. Over the last 2 to 3 years, it's been just constant. Call your congressman about this. This is bad. This is bad. And I think there's you create this sort of sky is falling environment where now your advocates maybe don't feel like they should engage anymore. They're not taking you seriously. So I would say that as we walk through what we're proposing as an advocacy strategy, these are recommendations, and we're designed them to sort of supplement and not supplant what you're already doing. So the extent that you can kind of build these messages and strategies into the materials you're already producing, that will be helpful. Our first big initiative is a community-wide sign-on letter. We are very, very close to having it final, and we hope to send it out through all the networks tomorrow. It is not your average letter, and it's going to take probably a little bit of education on the part of you and talking to your leaders. We did our best to make sure that every sort of possible federal program was sort of represented in this letter, because I know that's big for people. I don't see my priority listed, so I can't sign on. So we tried to make it as all-encompassing as possible and still keep it within one page. But it will require some education. And so Linda Couch on our steering committee actually wrote up a sort of FAQ about the letter that will hopefully help you educate people on why it's important to sign this, and we hope that people will see the forest for the trees. Our goal is to get upwards of 1,000, 2,000. Again, we had 900 with just health, education, and labor communities, and so I'm fairly certain that we can get a lot of signatures on this, maybe more than any letter ever, and we'll have a really get a lot of attention on the Hill. The NDD Summit will continue to do leadership-level meetings on the Hill and in the administration, really just to talk about what we're doing and talk about this effort more broadly. We are preparing, Christine Leonard from the Vera Institute of Justice is putting together a list of who we think might be gettable moderates in the House and Senate, with everything including what committees are they on, what are the areas that they're particularly interested in, their Twitter feeds for future use, and really so that this can be used by all of you in the community as you're starting to think, okay, who do I need to be meeting with and speaking with, going down this list. And so, for example, the Coalition for Health Funding will be looking to see anyone who's on a health committee of jurisdiction or is interested in health, and we'll be doing meetings with those folks. More critical to this effort is going to be outside Washington. I think all of us could do as many meetings as we want on the Hill, and it's not going to make any difference. We don't have the money to compete with the defense industry, but we do have people. And it's going to be absolutely critical that we engage the grassroots out in the community. Again, I know they're tired, but to the extent that we can, to get them in their in-district meetings, get them going to town halls over the summer, either in person or over the phone, taking advantage of local media, op-eds, letters to the editor in local papers. If they go to a town hall and they can get media there to talk to them, even better. Letters to members of Congress in the fall, tweets, etc. Just has to be an all-out blitz, and really just try to be as present as possible. And it has to be coming from back home. It can't just be here in Washington. So we are working right now, the NDD Summit, on preparing an NDD advocacy toolkit, which will really help you and help your advocates talk about NDD. Not many of us, I honestly didn't know much about NDD until probably about 3 years ago when I had to start caring about it, and thanks for CBPP for educating me. But what we plan to do is prepare an advocacy roadmap with sort of suggested activities and timeline over the next 6 months. We are developing a one-pager about NDD that we will share widely throughout the community that all of you can use and we encourage you to use. We also, based on this NDD one-pager, encourage you to do one-pagers of your own about the impact of the sequester in your specific community and the programs that you care about. Again, we're working on that list of gettable targets for you to use. We hope to draft sample talking points that your advocates can use in town halls or meetings here when they're in Washington. Some sample tweets for you to use at certain times as we prompt you and the advocates. We know the members love to tweet. They hate getting these tweets from us, so hopefully that'll be effective. And again, also other tools to educate your grassroots, like the recording of this session today. And we'd like to do even just a sort of sequester 101 for grassroots that, again, anybody can use and anybody can share. Bob and Ellen and CBPP can only be in so many places at so many times. So if we can make that widely available to you, hopefully that will help prime your advocates for more activity later this fall. And again, these are sort of suggested. It's optional, and we hope that you will engage wherever you can. At a minimum, though, that you'll sort of stick with that message of a balanced approach with no more cuts to NDD. So immediately next steps, I think, for the NDD Summit is we're going to be designing and disseminating that NDD fact sheet, getting it out as quickly as possible. Standard language for use in your Hill communications. There are going to be many bites at this apple, so even just a one paragraph that whenever you do a letter to the Hill or whenever you have a guest speaker coming in and testifying before a committee, you can just insert that language in there, make it really easy, but again, just repeating that NDD message. We will complete and share that list of targets with you, and we will start doing more media outreach about this effort and the NDD Summit. We're hoping to really use the sign-on letter to make a big splash about what we've been doing and why our community is important. What we hope that you will do in the next couple of weeks is consider signing on to that NDD letter and to circulate that letter widely throughout your communities. We're not just taking national organizations. We'll also be looking to get state and local organizations as well. Not individuals, though, just organizations. Begin to start estimating the impact, if you haven't already, of the sequester on the programs you care about. And I would emphasize that numbers are important, but the stories are really what's going to make the difference here. I think there are so many numbers, and the numbers are sort of meaningless without the stories. We also know that the numbers by themselves, when Americans hear the size of the cuts, they think it's great, when all they hear are the numbers. But when they start to understand what's behind the numbers and what the numbers actually mean, it's more compelling. So please start gathering those stories, those anecdotes, to really put some life behind those numbers. We hope you'll also, once you see the NDD sign-on letter, consider doing a sign-on letter of your own or just a press release or a statement to talk about your specific program, again, getting more into more detail, but following that framework of the balanced approach. And again, beginning to educate those grassroots now so we can have them ready for the fall. I think, as Bob noted, and it's more clear to me now, this is really a marathon, not a sprint. And our position now is a balanced approach. That may evolve over time, and there may be many bites at this apple going forward. And so we're going to have to kind of be nimble, have to be flexible. The plan, as we've outlined so far, is over the next 6 months. We may need to shorten that. We may need to lengthen that. But we'll keep meeting as the summit, and we hope to do another large event like this with a guest speaker, and we can update you on what the summit has been doing and what our next plans, activities are in the near future. Again, just quickly, slides, notes. The recording of this will be made available directly to everybody who RSVP'd, but the summit will also be sending it out, and we, again, encourage you to forward that widely. So
Great. Well, Emily really covered a lot of stuff. I'm going to thank Bob because he has to run. So we said we would wrap up by 4:30, so we have time for just a couple of questions or suggestions or comments or criticisms if you didn't like what you heard. So, again, if anyone wants to share anything or ask a question, tell us who you are and where you're from.
Ann Menard with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. In case someone asks, could you explain where the 8.4% cut figure comes from?
Yeah, so it actually comes from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. So nobody knows what the actual exact percentage cut will be because OMB will determine that, and it's going to be based on what the final Richard can explain this better. The final FY13 numbers are, but 8.4% is the Center's latest calculation of the across-the-board cut for non-defense, discretionary, non-exempt programs.
You're probably sorry you asked, but if you go to Table 2 on this this handout, you'll see how I calculated it. Basically, the calculation, the law details exactly what must be done, and there's no discretion allowed under the law. $109 billion has to be saved through sequestration on January 2nd, 2013. Half of that is defense, half of that is non-defense. Of the non-defense portion, some comes from Medicare and certain other entitlements. The rest of them are exempt by law. And therefore, of that $54.7 billion that doesn't come from entitlements, the rest comes from non-defense discretionary, and that happens by an across-the-board cut of all non-defense discretionary except those programs that are exempt. The programs that are exempt are Pell Grants and the discretionary programs of the Department of Veterans Affairs, except for administrative costs. So I made an estimate of how much money there would be for those programs based on the president's budget and the caps, and then divided, and that's 8.4%. It's going to be within a couple of tenths in that either way in that direction.
Okay, over on this side.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Zeitzer, and I'm on the steering committee for the Ad Hoc Group for Medical Research, and I also represent FASA, more medical research. Just a suggestion on that letter that you're going to be circulating. A number of us in this room work for organizations that may not have the most nimble process when it comes to stating policy positions, particularly if you're going to push us outside our comfort zone. So I would just suggest that when you guys consider the turnaround time on the letter, obviously deadlines are important, that it has to see the light of day, but a week isn't going to do it for some of us. So.
Yeah, so right now we're shooting for June 22nd to close the letter, so that's about 3 weeks, and we assume there'll be an extension. We tend to extend for a few days, so before July is sort of what we're hoping for, but June 22nd right now.
Yeah. Over on this side.
Hi, Kim Mushino with the Association of University Centers on Disabilities, and also a co-chair of the Fiscal Policy Task Force of the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities. Even in that consortium of over 100 national disability organizations, we feel so powerless right now with everything that's going on and all the bad news. So this feels really good, and this is brilliant to get all of us together. So thank you, first of all. Secondly, I just wondered, it is an election year, which is making everything tough, but it also presents an opportunity. And one of the things I feel like we haven't done is compare some of the proposals, like doing side-by-sides, especially, when Bob talked about some of Romney's proposals, and then we also have Obama's proposals and so on. But we've never seen them side-by-side so that we can actually give our constituents, here's some of the choices and here's how it will impact our programs. And I too, have not done a good job with that, but maybe that's one of the things that could be in the toolkit.
Yeah, the center did do an analysis of Romney's budget.
And of the Ryan budget. Yeah. But admittedly, they're not complete side-by-sides. Right. And because we're a 501c3, there's a limit to how much we can do that's directly political. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Barbara Kornblau, the Coalition for Disability, Health Equity, and Policy Chair of the APHA section on disabilities. My question is about the doc fix under Medicare and the cuts. The 2% is that, for those of you who don't know, Medicare was set up, there's this crazy formula where every year the docs get a cut, and providers get a cut. Every year they put it off and put it off and put it off, and now it's up to over a 20% cut that's due, and they keep putting it off and putting it off. So my question is, the 2% per year, is that in addition to what we're now up to, like 20%? So that, in other words, with the sequestration, doctors would get cut, providers would get like a 22% cut or whatever it's up to now, plus 2%.
Yes and no. The answer is that the sequestration and the SGR are independent. So if the SGR is not fixed and it goes into a place and it's a 25% cut, and then there's another 2% cut on top of it, it would be on top of it. On the other hand, sequestration is not 2% per year. It's 2%. During the 9-year period. So they'll get paid 98 cents on the dollar in 2013 and 20.
Point something, 0%. Okay.
So it's just 2%. It's not 20%.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking the 25. I didn't know the exact number. So. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Nancy Reeder with the State Directors of Special Education, and I really appreciate everything that you all are doing and certainly agree with philosophy behind it. One of my concerns is, by focusing on numbers and number cuts, that there are a lot of newly elected, perhaps, and maybe not newly elected members of Congress who just don't like the programs and don't believe they should be funded, period. So I'm concerned about an approach that focuses solely on the numbers without trying to explain why these programs are important to local communities. And you mentioned sort of in passing that if you go to those websites about defense cuts, they talk about the impact on local communities. And it would be great if we could do something like that, because I think people who are advocating doing away with certain programs don't really get what the impact on their local community is. And they just think that, for example, the federal government should not be involved in funding education, period. Yeah. Doesn't matter what the education program is.
When we sent out the letter, which we managed in one page to actually give a few some examples of what NDD is and what it means in different areas. So, we have some examples, but as Emily said, we need more stories, and then we need each coalition or sector to do its own analysis. So as an example, I'll mention NEA did a state-by-state analysis of not only what the cuts are to each program dollar for dollar, but how many children or students would be negatively impacted. So that's the kind of analysis, each organization or coalition has more expertise, obviously, in its own area, and we would encourage everybody to do those. You take 8.4%, and what does that mean to your program, and figure out what does that mean to how many people are served, or, whatever the case may be, and, distribute it and share it with us.
Okay, great. And that should be, again, to reiterate, so again, this is a voluntary effort. The people participating, we do not have a budget. We do not have analysts. We unofficially have CBPP helping us and advising us. But so, our goal as the summit is we're talking about NDD writ large. So when you see the letter and you see the numbers, it's what are the cuts to NDD? Right. It does not drill down into what are the cuts for research, environmental protection, the Weather Service, the national parks. We just don't have the capacity to do that. And so we're hopeful that by giving you kind of the foundation and the framework, you can take what we're doing as an example, talking about NDD, and extrapolate that out to talk about disability programs and immunizations and public health professions training. So you're kind of going to run with it. And we'd love to see examples because I think it's helpful to share. But we will not be producing a compendium of examples for every single NDD program. I just want to make sure we're clear on that.
Okay. So we're going to take these last three people standing at the mics. So go to that side.
I'm Don Mathis, the Community Action Partnership. Just a quick suggestion to the executive committee work would be those of us in Washington talk in words like non-defense discretionary, but in the real world, outside the people that read USA Today, that's going to be a disincentive to pay attention. So my recommendation would be to come up with some kind of 1, 2, no more than 3-word tagline, fairness, balance, whatever, the NDD coalition. It'll resonate better in the media, and it'll be the people that really want to motivate with letters to the editor. They're not going to wade through non-defense discretionary. So work your magic.
Yeah, that's a great point.
We talked a lot about this, and we agree. Non-defense discretionary doesn't describe what we are, it describes what we're not, which is never a great starting point. But I would argue the people that need to listen to us, the people on the Hill, this is how they think about who we are, whether we like it or not. Words like Xerox, Band-Aid, Coca-Cola, in and of themselves don't mean anything. But there's a brand identity associated with them, and when you say those words, you recognize what they are. Part of the reason people don't know what NDD is we don't really talk about it as NDD. We talk about it as research funding, public health funding, childhood education funding. So I think we struggle with this. We spend about half a meeting talking about it. Do we create something else, or do we work with what we've got? The risk being creating something else. Now the people we want to listen on the Hill really don't know what we're talking about. Yeah. And so for now, we're kind of sticking with the NDD. Again, our primary audience right now is the Hill. When we go public, I think, yes, we need to come up with a way to describe NDD so it's compelling, but I don't know that we're ready to wholesale get rid of the term NDD.
Yeah. No, it's a good point, though.
But we continue to think about it.
Okay. Helen.
Hi, Helen Blank. I lead the Child Care Early Learning Coalition. I have minor problems because part of our funding is mandatory, not for Head Start, but for the child care side. But I think the field is going to be very confused. I think what I'm concerned about is they're very confused now. We just sent an email asking people to join the Americans for Tax Fairness, coalition. And so people in the field at the state level who have trouble just going to say, give me some more child care Head Start money, which we also have them saying now, we've now told them they have to ask for revenue, which we have for a long time. And this is obviously very important too, but it's so hard to get them not to freeze up totally. I'm afraid that they're now going to be getting, ask for your programs, make sure we have revenue or this all isn't going to work, and make sure you don't cut NDD and save defense. And I think it's going to be a challenge for the field participation in this. So I would welcome, not this minute.
Yeah, I just think I think you're exactly right, but I think each group and coalition has to, interpret all this as for their own folks, and there's obviously different groups do that different ways. And again, as Emily said, you can take parts of these materials and incorporate. So we're not saying to your folks like tell them to join this coalition, this coalition, this coalition. It's like integrate what you're getting from us, from the tax, into what the right message is for your, constituents.
Yeah. And we are not, I think important again, we're not a coalition. We're a forum for coordination and dissemination. I mean, that's really how we're functioning.
No, I understand. It's sort of, what do you sign, and then what's your message, and they're all fighting their own state battles, and
that's
it's
true too.
a challenge.
Yeah. Okay, Randy.
I'm going to make this really quick. Randy Schmidt, YWCA, because I can see everybody's leaving. The YWCA is working with CHN to do a ton of town halls and just events across the country about kind of what I call Armageddon at the end of the year, which includes the Ryan budget, just non-defense discretionary spending, defense, the importance of revenue. So if anybody's interested in having their grassroots linked in or invited to these events, are primarily for people, the service community, education community, labor unions, religious groups, people who are in the field who would want to know what's going on, learn more. Contact Angie at CHN, or you can always email Rochelle or Debbie, and they'll put you into their field coordinator and link up into what we're doing.
Okay, if there's no other questions, we'll make this the very last question.
I'll be very fast. So, Emily, I appreciate that. I'm Nicole from the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials. I understand the staffing issues that you're not going to be developing a compendium, but because this is a forum, in what way will we be able to have the benefit of people sending things to you all with stories and statistics and impacts, and then have that come back to us? Because that would be really important. I think that there will be some areas where I may not be able to develop an impact statement, but there may be others around the room whose impacts I can share with my members that they may be able to utilize.
I think we need to think through that. Off the top of my head, I would suggest you work with the coalition leaders with whom you work. So, for example, when our people send me things about health, I forward them out to the Coalition for Health Funding.
Yeah.
But I'm struggling with Google Groups already. But there's no reason we can't have a Google Share area that people can peruse and so on.
Right.
So I think we'll talk about that with the summit and figure out the logistics of making that work.
Okay, well, I really, again, thank NEA for the space, thank Emily for sort of our overall coordinator, CPBB, and thanks everybody for coming. Oh, yes, I was like looking for my pen. I know. I don't know how to turn this. Oh, thank you.